Ontario's job market just hit rock bottom. 26,000 jobs vanished in a single month. Youth unemployment soared past 16%, and frustration is spilling into every corner of the province. Yet instead of offering a fix, Doug Ford stood before business leaders and told struggling young people to look harder for work, maybe at a fast food joint if nothing else. The room clapped, but outside, thousands of job seekers just shook their heads. When a leader blames the people instead of the system, what does that say about the state of leadership itself? The numbers don't match the panic. Canada's job market shows resilience, not ruin.
Doug Ford being Doug Ford. So let's go with something a little bit lighter than what we've been talking about. He's pulling the old look inside yourself, Rosemary, but to young people right now. He apparently has a direct line with Mark Carney, and Mark Carney is just dumping.
On a national level, Canada added approximately 67,000 jobs in October, and the unemployment rate dropped to 6.9%. These numbers indicate that employment activity is not collapsing. Instead, although still beset with weak spots, the labor market is modestly improving and showing signs of resilience. Contrast this with a true collapse scenario. The kind of job freefall one might associate with a deep recession would typically involve sustained job losses month after month, steep rises in unemployment, and widespread layoffs across sectors. None of those hallmarks are present in the October data for Ontario. In fact, Ontario led the country in monthly job creation in October, suggesting a regional rebound rather than a breakdown. That said, while the headline numbers are encouraging, they do not tell a full story of strength. Employment did increase, but the underlying details, including which types of jobs were added and where, reveal caution flags. To the extent that the collapse label has traction, it reflects deeper anxieties about the quality of jobs, underemployment, and structural shifts in work, rather than a literal collapse in the tally of people employed. Beneath the surface, why Ontario's job market still feels broken despite the numbers.
Low-skilled temporary foreign workers into the Canadian economy and just saying, sorry about your luck, young people. And Doug Ford has said, if you're struggling to find employment in Ontario, well, perhaps the problem is you.
Despite the positive spin in the raw numbers, many workers and observers continue to feel that Ontario's job market is on thin ice. One key reason is composition. The national data, for instance, show that while employment increased in October, plus 67,000 jobs, the entire gain was driven by part-time work, roughly plus 85,000 positions, whereas full-time employment declined by around 1,300 jobs. This shift matters. People don't just want a job. They want stable, full-time, well-paying roles. When part-time or less stable work grows while full-time recedes, it triggers uncertainty and undermines confidence, even if the net number of employed rises. Another driver of concern is sectoral cross-currents. The October figures revealed job gains concentrated in sectors such as wholesale and retail trade, plus 41,000 jobs, transportation and warehousing, plus $30,000, and information, culture, and recreation, plus $25,000. Meanwhile, sectors such as construction shed 15,000 jobs in the same month. In Ontario, where manufacturing, construction, and trades have been significant employment pillars, this kind of uneven sectoral picture stirs anxiety. Workers in trades may feel the pain of decline even while headline employment rises elsewhere. Thus, although overall employment is up, the composition of that employment is shifting in ways that many interpret as weaker or less sustainable. Thirdly, there is a whiplash effect of perception. In late summer and early autumn, labor market data looked much softer. For example, in September, Canada added 60,000 to 1,400 jobs, but the unemployment rate remained stuck at 7.1%. For Ontario especially, the unemployment rate had stalled at 7.9% in September before the drop in October to 7.6%. These earlier weak or flat readings primed media, workers, and policymakers for bad news. So when the October uptick arrived, the prior fear lingered. The net result, even though the data improved, sentiment remained fragile. In such an environment, talk of job market collapse can fill the unease. In the trenches of political communication, the job market dynamic becomes a tool of narrative. On one hand, the opposition in Ontario has seized on past weak readings and underlying anxieties to label the situation a jobs disaster, positioning the government of Doug Ford as having failed to protect stable employment, particularly in blue-collar sectors and among younger workers. Critics argue that although jobs might be added, what matters is whether they are high quality and broad-based, and that in many regions of the province, workers feel frozen out of growth. The political tug-of-war, Ford's victory lap, the reality on the ground.
And he says that they aren't looking hard enough, even as Statistics Canada reports a surge in joblessness across the province. And he said this before the Ontario Region Board of Trade breakfast. Well, that's why he said it. These are the CFIB types.
On the other hand, Ford's camp points directly to October's rise of 55,000 jobs in Ontario and leads the country in monthly gains as evidence that his government's policies are working. For example, the provincial government flagged the statistic in a social media post celebrating job creation despite headwinds. The tension between these two narratives, unemployment remains high, full-time jobs shrinking, versus we are adding thousands of jobs, lead the nation this month, defines the political battleground. Timing matters too. The figures arrive shortly after the provincial fall economic statement, a fiscal update in which the government projected persistent unemployment and economic headwinds. The job market rebound presented a welcome counterpoint to the gloomier projections, and thus became central to Ford's communication strategy. Meanwhile, opposition parties highlight that one positive month does not erase longer-term trends. In short, the politics of the moment amplify both the hope and the fear surrounding labor market data. Meanwhile, broader policy fights, such as Ford's controversial moves on speed camera bans and revisions to the province's climate action plan, help shape the backdrop of public sentiment. Critics argue that when citizens perceive distractions or discord in government, even a decent employment report may not fully overcome their anxieties about job security and economic direction. In this way, the job market data become a symbolic battleground. Is Ontario turning a corner? Or is the corner still far ahead? Even though the latest labor market numbers for Ontario and Canada more broadly show job creation, deeper digging reveals that for many people, the experience does not feel like a robust recovery. There are several key pressure points. First, the split between part-time and full-time jobs matters. Nationally, in October 2025, the overall employment rose by about 1,600 jobs, but those were entirely in part-time positions, roughly plus 85,000 part-time jobs, while full-time employment fell by about 18,500. That signals that while more people are working, many are in roles with fewer hours, less stability, and likely lower pay. It's one thing to say jobs up, and another to say good jobs up. Beneath the headlines, why more jobs doesn't mean Ontarians are better off. Yet
take up all the jobs down at the Wendy's and the Tim Hortons. Well, I don't know if Wendy's uses them, but definitely Boston Pizza.
Second, actual hours worked slipped. Even though employment numbers went up, the reference week, October 12th to 18, saw total hours worked dip by 0.2% across Canada. The decline is attributed in part to labor disputes and strikes, which temporarily reduced hours despite people being employed. That means someone might show up in the employment tally, but if they had reduced hours or were locked out in a labor dispute, their income and job security expectations may still be strained. Third, wage growth is improving, but still behind the curve of rising household costs. For instance, the wage growth for permanent employees in October hit about 4.0% year over year, up from 3.6% the prior month. But when you factor in inflation, rising housing rents, energy costs, and debt servicing, especially in a high interest rate environment, that 4% wage increase may not feel like much. So even though more people have jobs, many households feel squeezed. Jobs up, yes, but feels better, not quite yet. In short, the headline job number is positive, but the underlying shape of employment, mix of part versus full-time, hours worked, wage growth, suggests a labor market still in transition, with plenty of latent strain. For Ontario, which has a large base of full-time trades, manufacturing, and long-term careers, this means there is a gap between jobs exist and jobs are the kind people count on. Looking ahead, several structural issues in Ontario's economy create headwinds for the labor market, ones that aren't solved just by a monthly job gain figure. One major pressure is the interest rate hangover. High borrowing costs weigh on construction, real estate development, and small business investment. In sectors where hiring is sensitive to finance costs, construction crews, infrastructure trades, small builder firms, these elevated rates can suppress hiring or slow expansion. That means job growth may lag in traditionally robust full-time employment sectors, even as services jobs keep ticking up. Another structural strain comes from trade and tariffs. Ontario's economy is deeply integrated with the U.S., and recent tariff actions have rattled manufacturing and export-linked sectors. The provincial fall economic statement points out that disruptions from U.S. tariffs pose significant challenges for competitiveness in sectors such as autos and steel. To counter this, Ontario has launched relief programs, e.g., the Protect Ontario Financing Program, offering up to $1 billion in liquidity support to businesses hit by Section 232 tariffs. But support doesn't immediately translate into new full-time jobs, especially in industries where investment and supply chain disruption persist. A third structural issue is population growth versus job creation capacity. Ontario continues to absorb newcomers, both immigrants and interprovincial migrants, which raises demand for housing, infrastructure, and services. If job creation lags in high-quality employment relative to population growth, the result is upward pressure on housing and living costs, more competition for fewer good jobs, and increased perceptions of labor market weakness, even in a growing employment environment. While I don't have a precise chart in this piece, the rationale is clear. If population grows faster than stable full-time employment, the labor market bounce may be muted and felt differently across regions and sectors. Ford's Fix-It plan, training, deregulation, and damage control. Taken together, these structural pressure points mean Ontario's job market rebound is not simply a matter of monthly job tallies. Rather, the recovery must overcome deeper drag from interest rates, trade exposure, and demographic pressures. Against this backdrop, the government of Premier Doug Ford is using a three-pronged playbook to shape its labor market strategy and messaging. The question is whether what they're doing aligns with where the pain actually lives. First, the government emphasizes skills and training, deploying rapid response centers to help workers pivot from shrinking sectors, like trade-exposed manufacturing, into growing ones. Ajdis, transport logistics, retail is warehousing. A key part of the narrative is delivering good jobs rather than just any jobs. The idea, if we train you for the sectors hiring now, you'll land stable work. Second, the government leans on selective deregulation and investment incentives intended to stimulate job creation. For example, by easing red tape for enterprises, promoting advanced manufacturing, and offering supports for trade-impacted businesses. These are aimed at boosting full-time, well-paying jobs rather than just service sector hires. Third, the government highlights targeted support for trade-challenged sectors. As referenced above, the Protect Ontario Financing Program is one measure to help keep jobs intact in steel, aluminum, and auto. The challenge for Ford's playbook is whether it is aligned with where strain is. Full-time job decline, hours worked drop, wage stagnation, and structural trade interest pressure. While the training and support program route is helpful, critics argue that the pace and scale may not match the urgency of the full-time job shortfall and part-time job surge. In other words, yes, the government is doing things, but the litmus test is whether people in sectors feeling left behind can see tangible improvement, not just big monthly job numbers. To ground all this in real-life terms, let's look at some concrete examples of who's benefiting and who's still struggling. Winners and worriers, the real faces behind Ontario's so-called job market collapse.
Look, I think the underlying problem, I think the comments that Premier Ford's making.
Winners. Logistics and warehousing firms are ramping up hiring ahead of the holiday season and benefit from growth in the transportation sector. Nationally, wholesale retail trade posted about plus 41,000 jobs in October, transportation and warehousing plus 30,000. These are precisely the types of jobs growing: flexible, service-oriented, hiring quickly. For workers comfortable with part-time or shift work, this is a win. Worriers. On the other hand, small builder firms and tradespeople are facing mounting pressure from higher financing costs and slowing demand in construction. Despite overall job gains, full-time jobs are declining and hours worked are down, meaning many in traditional full-time trades feel vulnerable. Similarly, recent university or college graduates are finding that although employment is technically up in the province, many of the available positions are part-time or contract rather than the stable careers they expected. These two groups, trades and new grads, illustrate how the headline may read, "Jobs up by thousands," while on the ground the sense of job market fragility remains strong. The way headlines and public perception form around job market data is a complex mix of sound bites, timing, and selective focus. And in the case of Ontario, it shows up clearly. Back in August and early September, when labor numbers turned weak, the language of crisis replaced nuance. For example, when the national unemployment rate jumped to 7.1% in August and employment dipped by roughly 66,000, journalists describing Canada's labor market spoke of warning lights flashing. Provincially, Ontario's employment was reported to have slid by about 26,000 jobs in August, while the unemployment rate remained at around 7.7%. Those data points created fertile ground for headlines about job market collapse, especially in sectors and regions already under strain. Then came the October, or reference week mid-October rebound. Employment increased, and the unemployment rate dropped to 7.6% in Ontario, as noted earlier in your outline. This sharp pivot cast the prior doomsday narratives into sharper relief. They were not wrong about anxiety, but they may have been premature or overly broad. What this demonstrates is how media coverage leans heavily on change, up or down, and a single week report can spawn a collapse narrative long before a trend is established. Moreover, sectoral splits and lagging indicators like full-time employment or hours worked often don't get as visible as the job gain or job loss headline, yet they matter deeply. So, you get a media cycle where the weak August to September numbers trigger alarm. Commentary amplifies the crisis angle, and then a better October number softens it, but by then, the narrative machine has often already locked in. In that sense, the job market collapse message thrives on volatility, on a series of mixed signals, and on political commentary that favors drama. Even if the October data suggests improvement, the echoes of prior months and the underlying structural concerns keep the narrative alive. For readers, the takeaway is the headline may say collapse, but the timing, the sectors, and the lagging signals mean the real story is more of an uneasy hold than a full-scale breakdown or rebound. What to watch next? The data, sectors, and policies that will decide Ontario's job market story. Next labor force survey release. According to the schedule, the LFS for September, reference week September 14th to 20, was due for release in early October. Monitoring that next print will matter. Does full-time employment pick up? Does the unemployment rate edge down further or stall? Is the labor force participation rate shifting? A solid uptick could reinforce the improvement narrative. A stall or drop could reignite concern. Full-time rebound versus continued part-time tilt. One of the structural puzzles is that even when jobs are up, many are part-time or lower quality. As you pointed out earlier, national data show part-time jobs gaining while full-time roles fell in October. Keeping an eye on how full-time positions evolve in Ontario will help distinguish mere volume growth from meaningful recovery.
The problem with it is these are second-order conversations. The first-order problem is that we have an economy that has the lowest GDP of all the advanced economies. It has the worst performance except for a small city-state.
Construction and manufacturing prints and the job vacancy series. Sectoral strength matters. The sectors where Ontario has traditionally found its backbone of stable, high-quality employment, construction, manufacturing, and the skilled trades, are facing major headwinds. High interest rates have slowed housing starts and infrastructure projects, while trade exposure and lingering tariff tensions with the U.S. have disrupted export-oriented industries like steel and auto manufacturing. These aren't short-term issues. They affect investment confidence, hiring plans, and overall economic momentum. The monthly and quarterly data from the Survey of Employment, Payrolls, and Hours SEH, along with Statistics Canada's job vacancy numbers, will be crucial indicators of direction. If we begin to see rising manufacturing vacancies, stronger order books, and a rebound in construction hours, that would point to genuine recovery rather than just statistical noise. But if those numbers remain flat, or worse, decline, it could suggest that Ontario's growth is leaning too heavily on lower-wage service sectors, leaving its industrial base fragile. Another key factor to monitor will be regional divergence. Areas like Windsor, Hamilton, and Oshawa depend heavily on manufacturing strength. When those engines stall, local job markets suffer disproportionately. Meanwhile, regions dominated by logistics and retail may show temporary growth that masks deeper instability. A true comeback for Ontario's labor market will depend on whether its cornerstone sectors, not just its service jobs, start generating lasting, full-time employment again. Policy signals in the legislature, targeted supports or reversals. Policy signals in the legislature, targeted supports or reversals. The government's next moves can significantly reshape the hiring landscape across Ontario. According to the recently released 2025 Ontario Economic Outlook and Fiscal Review Fall Economic Statement, the province quietly lowered its job creation targets and warned of persistent trade and tariff risks that could slow down manufacturing and construction hiring. That admission hints at cautious optimism but also exposes the government's awareness that recovery remains fragile. Watching whether new supports, such as targeted grants for at-risk workers, regional job creation incentives, or relief for industries hit by U.S. tariffs, are introduced will reveal whether the province plans to act or simply talk. What happens next in Queen's Park will send a clear signal to both businesses and job seekers. If the Ford government continues emphasizing upbeat soundbites while avoiding deep structural fixes, confidence could evaporate quickly, especially among young and full-time workers still struggling to find stable employment. But if new measures focus on expanding vocational programs, cutting red tape for small businesses, and incentivizing employers to create sustainable, full-time positions, Ontario could begin turning its fragile recovery into real, broad-based momentum. The coming months will test whether Ford's team can move from political messaging to tangible economic impact, and whether Ontario's job market revival is real or just a temporary reprieve. So, what are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments below.